gap, unlock real unemployment pathways, and future-proof talent across over 20 industries. From the boardrooms of Sandton to the villages of rural South Africa, we are pulling the entire country into one decisive moment to tackle unemployment, close the skills gap, and future-proof our workforce. The conversation becomes a movement. The idea becomes an economy. This is not another event. It's an activation of Africa's potential. The Career Indaba Expo and Bootcamp 2026, where 5,000 delegates, 100 exhibitors, and 20 bootcamp zones collide to create the future of work. From youth innovators to corporate pioneers, from township traders to global brands, every voice counts. 2 days, one goal. Aligning Africa's skills with its opportunities. Career Indaba Expo and Bootcamp 2026. 15th to 16th May, Sandton Convention Center, where skills meet, where Africa works.
Good evening and a warm welcome to our next guest, Indaba Mokale. Indaba Mokale is a former MBA classmate, and it's one of those things. I had hoped to introduce him differently, but now that's what came to mind. But yeah, apart from that, we are definitely going to go into the thick of things and discuss everything about lifelong learning and about reskilling and about future jobs. Indaba Mokale, for his many sins, apart from being an MBA holder, he's in the very exciting space of AI and the space of data analytics, all of these things that sound sexy and complex and the in things. I will let him just to say a bit about his world and Algonomix before we get into the topic of the day.
Good evening, Kabi Kolobe. Just confirm you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, and good evening to all the viewers and the listeners. Yeah, thanks for the glowing introduction. Yeah, so maybe before we get into it, a little bit about myself. So I've been in the consulting space, let's call it management and IT consulting for what 25 years now. Most of it in the corporate space. I say corporate, but it's more, let's say, larger consulting firms. Started my career in that space, but a couple of years ago, I transitioned to a slightly different role, where still a little bit of consulting, but I've gone out on my own, and I've gotten into the AI space. I've always been involved in the data analytics space, and when we talk about skills, I'll touch a little bit on that. But recently, I've added some capabilities in the AI space. As you say, we were classmates at some point from a business perspective, but my original background, I studied a degree called quantitative management. If you asked me 20 years ago, where someone who studied quantitative management would end up working, it would be fundamentally different to what I actually ended up doing. And it's an interesting thing about skills that what you learn originally does not necessarily determine your destiny. So yeah, that's something that I've learned. But yeah, that's a little bit about myself.
Thank you for that. In fact, it's quite an interesting view that you are mentioning, and what comes to mind is probably at some point early on, before you did your first degree, you beyond when you were in primary saying you want to be a fireman or a doctor or a lawyer, you then had a conversation with yourself about what you are passionate about, what you're going to pursue. Now, if you were to have the same conversation with yourself today, how different would it look from the conversation you had back then?
Yeah, maybe let me start that with a little bit of a story in terms of how I ended up doing what I did. So and sometimes we tend to think of life as a certain path, and there's nothing that happens that takes you away from your path, especially in your younger days, right? So I grew up in a village in the northwest, and Dr. Masia was talking about mentors. And one of the challenges that we have is that you don't always have mentors, depending on where you come from. And so when you decide, or when you think this is what I'm going to do, this is who I'm going to become, it's almost a theoretical thing, because there aren't people that you can talk to, that you see, that sort of give you an idea of what this is all about. So unless you're doing something that's, I'll say, quite common, but it's not that common. If you want to be a doctor, if you want to be nurse, if you want to do something that where you interact with those people on a daily basis, you very rarely know what that career involves. So it's a bit of a leap of faith in terms of this is what I want to do. So pretty much from, I'll say, from maybe 10 years old, I always had this idea in my mind that I'm going to study engineering. Didn't really know what I was going to do with it, but I had that idea in mind. Now, there weren't really, as I say, people that you could talk to that say, okay, so when you study engineering, these are the things that you actually do with it. Now, and I did this, I had this thought pretty much up to my matric year. And you can imagine for almost a decade, I'm thinking this way. But literally, I think within 6 months of the end of my matric year, I fundamentally changed what I was thinking. And I thought, I'm not really doing this because it's what I want to do. I'm doing this because someone somewhere gave me an idea that this is a good idea, and it's not really what I want. So I fundamentally changed what the track that I was taking. Hence, I then ended up studying quantitative management. It was a new thing. It in certain respects is also called operations research. So it's all about using statistics to improve processes and business and so on and so forth. So it was a new thing, which sounded interesting to me. Hence, I wanted to take it on.
Okay.
Fast forward to my graduation and eventual looking for a job. I also had a very clear idea of what job I wanted. Again, it wasn't something where there were mentors that could say, having studied this, the best place to work is here, right? So you sort
Yeah.
of TV, you look at interesting things and you say, that sounds interesting to me. So roundabout, and this is now in the early 2000s, there was a lot of interesting thing happening in the financial markets, especially in the US, around financial derivatives. And I was very captivated with it. And so that's what I wanted to do. And I went to numerous interviews to essentially pitch what I wanted to do, right? Which is around financial derivatives. And I would say probably in half of those interviews, I was laughed out of the interview because the people with the experience thought you are mad. That's not what we're hiring for. There's too much risk attached to these things. We don't want to touch it, right? So I then end up doing something completely different. So having done my initial degree, and not getting the job, the dream job that I want, I then sort of pivoted and studied computer programming. So I did a 6-month computer programming course. But the college that was offering it essentially almost guaranteed you a job at the end of it. And that's how I got into the analytics space. And when I then look back, I say, so a lot of data analytics has a lot to do with what I originally studied, but that's not what I wanted to do. So it's almost like a pure luck that what I studied ends up being relevant for what I'm then working on 5 years down the line, right?
Down the line.
But to answer your question, my experience then tells me, if I were to give advice to my younger self, is to not necessarily have this set view that there's a path and this is the only path, because in a way that sort of delays your progress, because as long as you're waiting for the perfect thing, opportunities are passing you by and you are completely oblivious to them, because you've got blinkers on that say this is what I want to do. So an advice I would give to my younger self is to say, be a little bit more open to things that are maybe adjacent or maybe even quite far from what you thought you would be doing, but also have a little bit of patience. Have a little bit of patience that what you studied, what the knowledge that you've acquired will become useful at some point. The idea that I've studied something, if I don't use it, it's a waste, is sort of, it blocks you from being able to consider opportunity. So that's probably the one lesson that I would give to my younger self.
That is very profound, very, very profound. I think from the discussion so far, the idea of mentors is quite key. And I guess this next one about keeping your options open is super profound, especially in the current environment that we find ourselves in. Now, moving on to today, let's fast forward. We are now in 2025. You go everywhere, AI is the main thing, and there's fear, there's excitement, it's going to take away our jobs. Help us understand, help us navigate what is artificial intelligence, what is at the core of it, what can we do to familiarize ourselves with AI, how can we be AI ready as young people to become better positioned for careers of the future.
Yeah. So I'll sort of take there's two tracks to this, and the one is around being involved in AI from a technical perspective, and the other is using AI in what you do, right? And the two are sort of fundamentally different. I mean, at its core, AI is around using machines or computers to help you do things that are traditionally done by human beings, right?
Yeah.
So unlike traditional computing or traditional software, if I can call it that, with traditional software, you literally tell it the steps of how to do something. So you say, if you see this, you must do that. If you say that, you must do that. So you almost have to think about every scenario and say, if this happens, this is what the software must do, right? So that's traditional computer programming. Now AI comes along, and AI has been around for over 50 years, right? It's sort of evolved over time and become much more popular, but it's not necessarily a new thing. There may be new methods or new ways of doing things, but it's not fundamentally new. Now, how that changes from traditional software development is now, instead of thinking about what could be and how I address that, AI says, I will look at data. I would look at data that tells me what's actually happening, and I will learn from that data. And based on that, I will build something, right? and this something mimics how a person would do something. So it's sort of, when we say it thinks, it's primarily it learns. It learns from the data to say, this is what the data has shown me, and from that I can surmise that these are the things that I need to do. Now, the difference between, I suppose, us as human beings and how we learn and how AI learns is that we sort of most acquire things randomly, or we acquire knowledge randomly. But AI is sort of programmed to work in a specific way to learn. But the impressive thing about it is that it essentially doesn't forget, right? You may learn something 20 years ago, which you don't remember anymore. And it may take quite a random thing to make you remember the thing. Whereas AI remembers today what it learned yesterday in the same level of proficiency as the thing that it learned 20 years ago. And that's where the suppose the transformation is, to say all the knowledge that you've ever acquired is there at the click of a button, as opposed to I need to go and think about this, right? So that's where the power comes from. Now, there's essentially people that go and, for lack of a better word, program these systems to say, this is how the AI must learn. This is the data that goes into the process. This is the output and all of that. So that's quite a technical thing that traditionally you need to come from let's say you need to come from a STEM background, right? Mostly mathematics. But that doesn't mean if you don't come from that background, you now can't use AI at all. For the majority of let's say the past 50 years, the average person has not been able to use AI because you needed to have the mathematical skills in order to use it. But what's happened is that in the past couple of years, and I'll use ChatGPT as an example, is that the guys that built this then said, let's put a front end on top of this technical thing that makes it easier for you and me to interact with it. And the more you interact with it, the more that it learns from you, first of all, but the more that you get comfortable that I can actually do so many other things with it. And so it's just about your openness to try out different things and see what you can get out of it. So while there's a lot of fear around jobs, I'm less concerned around the loss of jobs stemming from the adoption of AI. And the reason I'm not as concerned is that up to now, a lot of the investment that has gone into AI has been around the building of the AI as opposed to the using of it. So we're still scratching the surface when it comes to the using of it. And I look at it and say, in your own job, you can look at it and say, I've been struggling with this thing. It's something that's quite mundane that I don't want to do. Can I look at how AI can help me do this? Because this is not what I want to spend my time doing. And that frees up your time to do other things that add more value to you and to the organization that you might be working for. So this creates a lot more opportunities for people to do things that they have not been able to do before. So hence, a little less worried about jobs. But maybe also related to that, there's also new jobs that come with this new industry, if I call it that. If you think back to maybe the late 90s or the early 2000s, we were just starting with the internet age, right? And we didn't really know what this thing was. But if you look at some of the largest organizations today globally, and the jobs that they've created, a lot of it stems from the invention of the internet. So if you think about an Amazon, right, I would hazard to guess 90% of or maybe not 90%, a large part of the jobs that Amazon has created, it would not have created if the internet did not exist. But we
Yeah.
would have been
Yeah.
worried in 1999 to say, well, how are we going to create jobs in the retail space? Well, Amazon has shown us how to do it, but they relied on this new technology that people feared at the time. And I sort of take a similar view to AI to say, we don't necessarily need to
Yeah.
know what's going to happen 5 years from now. We can be confident that human beings will come up with ways of taking advantage of this to create bigger economies and more prosperity for everyone.
Yeah. Look, I'm reminded by the producer that we need to take a small commercial break, and we will do a follow up to this particular topic. And just to remind our audience, the topic for today is around lifelong learning. It's around reskilling for future jobs. And with me tonight, I've got Tebogo Mokale, who is one of the AI practitioners. He is demystifying AI for us, and hopefully he will even shed more light about opportunities that are there. So yes, producer, we can go to a break.
From the balance sheet to the streets, from board strategy to worker reality, this is CI Business, where leadership means labor and purpose drives profit. We connect policy to people and data to development. CI Business, the sound of Africa's responsible leadership. If unemployment is a crisis, now what? We are moving from talk to action. Career Indaba Impact Week, the Boardroom Takeover. A 5-day live broadcast activation from 27 to 31 October 2025, 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. daily. Hosted by Career Indaba Board members leading Africa's biggest conversations on employment, skills, youth empowerment, and inclusive growth. Bring a pledge, a placement, or a partnership. Catch us live on careerindaba.org and all our social media platforms. Career Indaba, the voice of Africa's labor market. Hello Africa! Want to stay plugged into the world of work? Follow us at Career Indaba on LinkedIn, Instagram, and X, and dive deeper at careerindaba.org.
Welcome once again. As just a short reminder, this is the Boardroom Takeover hosted by Career Indaba, and we are having our Impact Week, where we are discussing everything to do with jobs, particularly for the youth, and how we can better their prospects. And with me is Indaba Mokale, who is talking everything AI. And very importantly, he was in the process of demystifying this thing. And I think, Tebogo, you make a very interesting and compelling case around the internet and the impact it has had when one looks at the adoption, the spin-offs in terms of businesses that have grown as a result. And it's hard to argue with, and one can potentially look at AI from that perspective, as opposed to thinking this thing is going to take away my job. We've seen some use cases, maybe elementary ones, call centers, where you now start seeing AI taking over, running calls, and we know business is always about bottom line. If it means a machine can do it, it means businesses always have that instinctive decision to say, we'll go for the machine as opposed to somebody who will complain or who will get tired, and their productivity is not the same. So yeah, looking at AI, my personal experience, and this is where I sometimes get confused. In my other role, I do research work for the Institute of Futures, and we write short articles on a monthly basis that go into a publication. Now, I wrote, it can take me 5 days to write a decent paper that is edited, that is proper and meet the standards. I once challenged Grok, the X thing, AI thing, and I gave it a topic. It wrote such a beautiful piece, and I thought to myself, am I now wasting time doing research, doing all the things that you do to do research? Why can't I just outsource this thing and let it do it? I'll do the thinking, think of a chapter, and then it can just write. I know people in academia will think there's plagiarism, there's all sorts of things. So how can we embrace AI as a collective, both as academia, as corporates, and as people, such that it is useful for all of us and we get to do things that add more value, as opposed to me sitting and building a spreadsheet that hardly adds value.
Yeah, so I think it all starts from the premise of fear, right? If I fear that I'm not equipped to, for lack of a better word, compete with AI, my approach to it is to sort of close shop, as opposed to if I see it as a sparring partner. Together, we can produce something better than I can do by myself and that the AI can do by itself. I have some knowledge of the subject matter or the area that I'm talking to. I mean, you're talking about future studies. Now, there's probably a lot of research in that area that a Grok knows about, right? But Grok is not necessarily a teacher or a professor, right? It's in the end, it's a predictive machine that says, I'm going to put together a number of words that make sense. But you know something about this area where you could challenge it to say, that's not the best answer that you could give me. Or I know something else that you haven't mentioned. And how do you combine what I'm mentioning to you with what you've given me? And you get a better and better output. And so when you approach it from that perspective of embracing this sparring model, you end up with better solutions than if you start from the place of fear and say, I don't want to touch this thing, or I'm afraid that it's going to give me incorrect answers and hallucinate all of those things. Now, you then also touch on an important topic, and it touches on education, to say things like plagiarism, things like I assign an assignment to students and all they do is go and use this technology, and in the process they don't learn anything, or at least they don't learn what I want them to learn, right? And there's that concern. And to be honest, we're figuring this out as a society to say, where are the boundaries here? Some universities, when ChatGPT came out, started looking at these tools to go and detect if an assignment had been written by AI. So they were investing a lot of money in essentially catching the cheats, right? But perhaps they would have been better off saying, okay, maybe this gives them some foundational knowledge that we can then build on, as opposed to spend all our time being policemen and trying to catch the cheats. Perhaps they don't have to spend half a semester on something that they can learn in a week, and we can spend our time exploring new areas. If I think about my own education from a university perspective, what I was learning probably hadn't changed for the previous 30 years. I could have learned it 30 years prior and it hadn't changed, right? So I spent a large part of my time learning the things that don't really change the world. They might change my world, but they don't change the world. Where if I could shorten this time that I learn the fundamentals, I possibly have more time to then start learning new things or coming up with new things. Now, one of the areas that we think about is to say, are universities giving us the education or the skills that we need in the marketplace? And perhaps we're still stuck in this paradigm of we've done it this way for 100 years and it has worked for 100 years. But there's been a fundamental change in technology that says maybe we should start questioning whether that's the most effective way or the most efficient way that we can do this. You can think about writing research papers. A lot of it is just about locating information. It's not even
Yes.
applying your mind, right?
True.
It's not really about applying your mind, it's about finding the information. Now, possibly, if I can get the AI to find the information for me, and I can verify that it's not hallucinating, it's real information that exists, that it's out there, it leaves me with more time to do the thinking, to do the stuff that creates new knowledge, right? And we should embrace this as opposed to think we've done it this way for 100 years, we should keep doing it the same way.
You are touching on to what was going to be my next question to you then, to say, in this coexistence with AI, surely there's still a lot of value that comes from humans. And what do you think is that value? What are the critical skills that cannot be replicated necessarily by AI that still add value? What would you think those are?
So I'll touch on two of them, and maybe they are sort of two sides of the same coin. So one is problem solving, and the other is creativity. Now, when I think about it from an AI perspective, I've got a problem, and I say to the AI or to the tool that I'm using, help me solve this problem. But I'm giving it too broad a challenge to solve. And therefore, it is unlikely to come with something that's quite groundbreaking. However, chances are I understand the problem much better than it does. And therefore, my understanding of the problem helps me frame the problem better, which is 90% of coming up with a good solution. The AI is not going to do that for you. So that interaction, a lot of it is about my understanding of the problem. And it's not my understanding because I've read about it or it's in some book. It's because I've lived it, right? I've experienced it. And therefore, I have insight that the AI will never have. Then the other side of that coin about creativity is that as a human being, I can link two things that are completely unrelated, right? And the AI is unlikely to do that. The AI follows a certain track given the prompt or the direction that you give it. But I can veer completely off track and think about something completely unrelated and link it to the current challenge that I have or the current solution that I have in mind. And that opens the door for a completely different solution. So that teaming between myself and the AI allows it to do, I'll call it the mundane, but it's like doing the stuff that is mostly around collating information, whereas I do more of the thinking around this is the problem, this is how I've experienced the problem, this is how I think I can frame the problem, and also I've seen something that's maybe vaguely related. How does this relate? And when I then prompt it that way, I get it to do something that it originally would not have done by itself. So those are some of the core skills for me that are going to become more and more important. And it's not just the I know we've talked a lot about AI, but it's not just an AI thing. It's
mm,
the
mm,
core skills, no matter what you're involved in. I look at one of the challenges that perhaps the biggest challenge that we have of creating jobs for the youth. And we tend to approach it from the perspective of how can we incentivize big business to create jobs for the youth? But we can look at it from the perspective of, so the youth don't have jobs. If we give them the skills, and AI or being able to work with AI is just being one of them, they've got challenges that they face every day in their communities. When I sit in a township, when I sit in a village, I face quite specific challenges that I don't face if I'm in the city. And it's unlikely that someone who sits in the city will come and solve that problem for me in a way that's satisfactory for me. So I take what they give me, but that's not the best solution that I could get. Whereas when I'm sitting there, I understand the problem quite well because I live it every day. And that gives me an opportunity to go solve the problem. If I've got some of the foundational skills that allow me to think about this problem and how I can solve it. And in solving it, I'm creating one, employment for myself, a business
mm,
for myself, and I can also employ other people, right? So there's a myriad of problems that we need to solve as a country, but that's also the vehicle that we use to solve the greatest problem, which is around unemployment. If we simply say the largest organizations, the largest banks, the largest telco companies or government will create the jobs, we are fooling ourselves because as we've been talking about AI and as these organizations look at the bottom line and want to become more and more efficient, they themselves are saying, but we can grow without fundamentally increasing the pool of employment. So it's the
yeah.
wrong it's the wrong track for us to be looking at. Now, I'm not necessarily saying everyone can be an entrepreneur or that everyone should try to be an entrepreneur. But we have too low a level of entrepreneurship because we tend to think about it from the perspective of how do I make money as opposed to
Mm,
what problem can I solve. And when I think about what problem can I solve, I don't have to sit and think long about this. I just need to think about the things that challenge me every day. Those are the things that create the opportunity for me to
opportunities.
be an entrepreneur and for me to solve the unemployment problem.
Mm. Yeah, I hear you, and you do make a very sound argument around it. Now, the South African situation, and maybe now moving away from AI, but now talking broadly in terms of macros. South Africa is, I don't know, we've been having this very lethargic economic growth now for a good 2 decades. If you compare that to, we are seeing Eastern Europe emerge as a center for all of these things. I mean, I've seen some of the work that is done by developers who are in high school in countries like Estonia,
Mm,
building world-class apps. High school students, this is what they do part-time. Now, I ask myself, how did that come about? I don't think there was a CETA or there's a center where he has to go via from school to do this thing. There has to be something else that makes these countries make the strides that they're doing. And my fear is that we are currently not finding that sweet spot that encourages the same outcomes in the SA context.
mm,
And that being the case, if this goes on for longer, we are going to lose out in the race, completely lose out. Uh, Estonia is just an example. Take the likes of Kenya. I always make that example. Kenya, I think my first visit to Kenya was around 2001. Uh, my hosts then had their helper come in late, and her excuse, I'll call it excuse, to say why she was late, was that she was stuck. The queue was long at the internet shop. She had a few things to do. If I try to relate that, it's now 2025. I don't think my helper has ever been late because she was at an internet shop. Yes, maybe we no longer use internet shops, but she hasn't said she was late because she was doing some sort of transacting. This is where I'm now thinking, is there a new divide that is currently unfolding in front of us? Are we in the same race with the rest of the world when it comes to these new technologies? Your thoughts?
Yeah. I'll first maybe start with the aspect of education related to this, where I think specifically in South Africa, and it's somewhat different to the rest of Africa. We've for a long time tended to see education as sort of like an end in itself or some milestone, right? So at first you had to get matric. So in order to progress in life, you need to get matric. And we don't really think about, okay, so what do you do with the knowledge there? And so you had more and more people now getting matric, so the supply increases, whereas the demand hasn't really shifted. So now we set the bar a little bit high and say, okay, now you need a diploma or a degree. And again, you've got more and more people acquiring diplomas or degrees, not necessarily to say this is what I'm going to do with it, but to say, in order for me to even get the opportunity of an interview for a job, I need to have a degree. So it's irrelevant to me what I'm going to do with it. I need to have a degree, right? So to a large part, we've put these milestones. I mean, we are in matric exam time now. Come December, we await matric results as if they are the most important thing in a young person's life. But you and I have been around long enough to know that in the bigger scheme of things, it's actually quite a small thing, right? It may open
Yeah.
the door to go to university or to do this or to do that, but in the bigger scheme of things, it's not that important. Now, you mentioned Eastern Europe and places like Estonia, where you may have young people that don't even have a matric, but they're building applications, right? Now, I'm going to link this to what I said earlier around solving the challenges that you see in your community. I don't need a matric to build an app. I don't need a university degree to solve a problem that I see, or to use AI or to do ABC. I can do that because it's something that I'm passionate about. I have some knowledge that enables me to at least start with the problem. I don't necessarily have to know everything about the solution, or everything that I need to know to build the solution. I can collaborate, I can learn, but I start from the premise of this is actually something that's useful to society. And if society finds it useful, it will pay me for that solution. Whereas we say, get education, we'll figure out what happens after. And we then create a bigger and bigger and bigger problem. Granted, we can't divorce where we are from our history. And a lot of our history is tied into the types of industries that dominated the economy. So mining being a prime example, where to go underground, you didn't need to have a matric. So it wasn't something that was valued. But now you may need to have a matric. But I would argue, for someone, for the vast majority of people, it's actually not that important. It would be much more useful to teach them about things that would make them better at mining, right? So for me, learning about all these other things in school are not that relevant to me being better at mining. But because we've set these milestones that define our lives, we can divorce ourselves from that and think about it from the perspective of what do I actually do with this? What problem do I solve with this? Now, you are right in terms of saying, and specifically from a South African perspective, we are falling behind. In fact, I would counter that we are falling behind even compared to the rest of Africa. And perhaps if you look at the countries that we're falling behind to, is mostly the countries that didn't have the resources. So they didn't have that resource curse that says you've got all these minerals and therefore you don't have to learn anything. It's the guys that said, well, we don't have anything. So the best thing that we can acquire is education in order to then learn and solve problems. And we are falling behind to those guys and to the guys in Eastern Europe. And I won't even mention the Asian guys. Now, if you think about some of the big organizations globally and what they're doing, they may be domiciled in the US, but they're not American companies. They are global companies. And they sell products in your village, in your township, in your city, right? So they compete with you, a potential developer from or solution developer from that area. And the longer you take to start competing or building, the more space you give them to essentially take over that market to the point where you will not be able to compete. So I think we need a bit of a rethink from an educational institution perspective, from a government perspective, and from a business sector perspective to say the way that we're approaching skills, education, and jobs is very much rooted in the economy of yesterday as opposed to the reality of today and the reality of South Africa.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. Thanks for that. Just a reminder to our audience, this is the Boardroom Takeover hosted by Career Indaba. I've got with me Tebogo Mokale talking everything to do with AI, but specifically around reskilling, lifelong learning, and future jobs. And as we come to a close and in wrapping up, I will take you back to, I think it must have been 2010 towards the end, as we concluded our MBA program. There was a panel that had in them, there was an managing director of an Indian bank that operated in SA. And the context to this, 2008, 2009 was the economic crisis. Many jobs were shared. But that guy said something that stuck with me for a very long time. He spoke about the culture of organizations in SA, where he was lamenting that we are too quick to respond by shedding jobs to just about any shock. And he even quoted statistics from his own bank where he said, in this crisis, we still hired more people and never shed jobs. I'm just sharing this. It will probably be a reminder to you. You will remember it. But now, as we wrap up, as you give your closing remarks, what can we do? Who must be that first mover to start enabling some of these things? How do we regain that competitiveness that maybe was there? Because South Africa is a very strange country in that in amongst all of these things that we lament about, you have the Shuttleworths emerging out of SA, creating multi-billion businesses. So it means it can be done. What do we need to do to tap that resource that is there? And yeah, we just need to be mindful of time as you close it. And Mokale, then we can hand over.
Yeah, so I mean, you specifically ask who should be the first mover here. I'm going to say business, right? But I'm going to caveat that. When I say business, I don't necessarily mean existing business. I'm going to say business from the perspective that we create value through businesses. And when you create that value, others see it and say, I also want part of that. And it creates competition, and it creates a market, and it creates customers. And so in so doing, we grow the economy. If we start from the perspective of let's create jobs, we are in effect saying we've got this finite thing. Let's find ways of putting more and more um, into this thing, or having more and more people get a slice of this cake. Whereas we should be saying, how can we make this cake bigger? And we make this cake bigger through business. Understandably, government has a role to play, and government has a role to play both from a regulatory perspective, but also in terms of the enabling environment for business to succeed, right? So when I talk about um, a guy in the township or a young person in the township, in the village that can start a business to solve a problem that people in the village are experiencing, they can't do that if they don't have connectivity. They can't do that if they don't have access to a computer or some other thing that helps them solve this problem. Now, government can then say, how do we partner with you to enable you to do this? We're not going to dictate to you what you must do, but we're going to create the enabling environment for you to do this. Our regulations are going to make it easier for you to start a business, and they're going to incentivize you to start a business. If See, when I think about it, when you are employed, one of the most difficult things, and I learned this because I was employed for 20 years, one of the most difficult things about starting a business when you're employed is that you have a salary. And letting go of that salary is one of the biggest hurdles to get over. Whereas if I'm sitting at home and I don't have a salary, it's a much smaller hurdle, if a hurdle at all. And therefore, I am ripe for this conversation where government can say, okay, I'm going to create an opportunity by giving you some resources that enable you to do 1, 2, 3 that you want to do. I'm not going to tell you what that is, but I'm going to create the opportunity to do that. But government can also then mobilize big business. So when I think about the likes of Google, the likes of Microsoft, the likes of Amazon, they're investing quite a lot in skills and the youth to say, we want to empower you, not necessarily to come and work for us or to go work for a big business doing these things, but so that you can solve problems yourself using these skills that you've required. So you've got big business that can play that role, and more of South African big business, not just the guys from Silicon Valley, and government itself working together, but also then bringing in aspects of labor, for example, to say the way that we've traditionally approached these things needs to change, right? If we are forever thinking about protecting current jobs, we're not thinking enough about creating new ones. So I think it's a little bit of a pity about this dialogue that was supposed to happen, because this is the type of thing that we should be talking about, to say we are not going
Absolutely.
to solve the challenges of South Africa in the way that we've thought about it over the past 20 years. We need something fundamentally different. So,
Different.
so my closing remarks on this is to say, let business be the leader and the catalyst, but we need to be working towards a common goal. And we all need to understand that if we don't solve this unemployment challenge, it's not a problem for the unemployment, it's a problem for everyone. Uh,
Yeah.
Someone sitting in their high walls in a suburb is not going to enjoy their lives as long as we have these challenges. So it's all
Yeah.
in our interests to work together to solve these challenges.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. And Mokale, I must thank you profoundly. You took on the challenge and you ran with it like a pro. Thank you so much. And this is me signing off. Kabi Kolobe. This is the Boardroom Takeover hosted by Career Indaba. We hope to see you in the Mokale when we host our Career Expo, where you can come and showcase what Algonomix can do and power us into the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tebogo Mokale. Appreciate it.
If unemployment is a crisis, now what? We are moving from talk to action. Career Indaba Impact Week, the Boardroom Takeover, a 5-day live broadcast activation from 27 to 31 October 2025, 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. daily. Hosted by Career Indaba Board members leading Africa's biggest conversations on employment, skills, youth empowerment, and inclusive growth. Bring a pledge, a placement, or a partnership. Catch us live on careerindaba.org and all our social media platforms. Career Indaba, the voice of Africa's labor market.